Welcome to Mortality Matters, a podcast about conceptual issues in the philosophy of death and the meaning of life. I am your host, Matthew Jernberg. When is death bad for you? Presuming for the moment that it is indeed bad for you. In this episode of the podcast, I shall cover Chapter 4 of John Martin Fischer's book, Death, Immortality, and Meaning in Life, entitled It's About Time, Timing in Mere Images. This will be the first part of a two-part treatment of this chapter, and in this part I shall focus on the timing of mortal harm, that is, the harm that death causes us. In order to understand what makes death harmful, presuming that it is harmful, it's important to make analogies to other types of ordinary harms that we're more familiar with. From there, we can hopefully have a better understanding, in these typical cases, of the atypical case of what makes death itself harm the one who dies. To this end, John Martin Fischer considers torture as a rather extreme and easy-to-imagine type of harm. The problem with this example, however, is that torture is an umbrella term that covers many different kinds of harm that befalls people. There are the more obvious types of torture in which people are maimed or fingernails or teeth are pulled out. And then there's waterboarding or other forms of sleep deprivation as a form of psychological torture. So let's just focus on a simple, ordinary case that most people encounter in their lives, just waking up in the morning and stubbing your toe. Suppose you wake up in the morning, you get out of bed, and in the act of getting out of bed, you stub your toe on the dresser. It hurts, but suppose that in this particular occasion, there's the initial stubbing of the toe, which at first shocks you a little bit. You're surprised by this, but then it only really starts to hurt a few seconds later when it begins to throb. And there's a certain throbbing that results from the stubbing of your toe, and this hurts. So, when was it bad for you to stub your toe? Presumably, it wasn't bad for you to stub your toe before you actually stubbed it, right? So Fischer takes it as a kind of beginning intuition that in ordinary cases of harm, the timing of when the event harms you is during or after the event itself. And in the case of stubbing your toe, which is my example, but I actually took it from Ben Bradley in his book Well-Being and Death, the time at which the stubbing of your toe is harmful to you is during or after the stubbing of the toe itself. That's also why I added in some further details to this hypothetical, in which the throbbing only begins a few seconds after the initial stubbing of the toe. The first second, you're in a kind of neutral state of surprise, and then the throbbing begins later. So we think we might understand when stubbing your toe is harmful to you, but what about death? We're supposing for the sake of the argument that death does harm the one who dies, and if so, when does death harm you? Well, we're also supposing a secular worldview in which death is the permanent cessation of your existence, and on this view, it would be quite mysterious to think that death would harm you after you die. But if death is anything similar to other types of harm, like stubbing your toe or even torture, then there should be some time at which it is bad for you. So the question, for the moment, is to figure out when that is. And I think the reason this question of the timing of mortal harm is particularly important is because there's an argument that death is harmless on the basis of its timing. I shall call this the timing argument. Now, in this chapter, Fischer conflates the descriptions of what he thinks of as a timing argument with a different kind of argument, which we'll consider later. So, for the moment, let's consider a timing argument from the philosopher Benjamin Bradley. So the first premise of this argument is that all harms must be harmful at a time. That is to say, for anything that is a harm for someone, there must be some time at which it is harmful. That's the first premise. The second premise is that, well, there is no time at which death harms the one who dies. Therefore, so we conclude, death does not harm the one who dies. So you could just accept the conclusion and in that way agree with Epicurus and the Epicureans. However, Fischer would regard that conclusion as premature because it does not comport with common sense, which he thinks holds that death does harm you. So if you wish to disagree with the conclusion, then, according to this argument, you must decide which of the premises is false. Now, what we can do here is we can categorize the different possible responses about the timing of mortal harm in accordance with how they disagree with this argument. So, for instance, if you think that the second premise is false, that is to say, you think that there is a time at which death harms the one who dies, well then the question is when that is. Now, as far as I can see it, there are fundamentally only three possible answers to this question, and then combinations therein of these three possible answers. So either death harms the one who dies before you die, when you die, that is to say, during the death itself, or sometime afterwards. And that's it. Now, when considering the event that consists in your death, the thought here is that there's 3 possible responses as to when your actual death harms you, and that's before, during, or after the death itself. And those can be separate responses considered individually, or alternatively, you could take a combination of those possible responses. There's 3 options, so I suppose there are 6 possible combinations. So for each of those possible responses, they would each be a way of denying the second premise of the timing argument, in order to argue that death does harm the one who dies and reject the conclusion that it does not. Okay, so that's not the only possible response to the timing argument. Alternatively, one may instead reject premise 1. That is to say, to reject the idea that all harms must be harmful at a time. Now, if you were to reject that premise, I might ask you, which harm is timeless? So you might say that there would be a difference between those harms that we might describe as timed, that is to say, timed harms, in order to distinguish them from timeless harms. And of course, you might think that death is a timeless harm because there is no time at which it is harmful to the one who dies. Now, you may even go so far as to say that this generalizes to all the harms. And you might think that for anything that harms you, there is no time at which it harms you. But that seems to be, at least prima facie, implausible. Going back to my case of the stubbing of the toe, well, when you woke up this morning, suppose you woke up with your alarm clock at 7 a.m. and in that very same minute you jumped out of bed and in your haste, that's why you stubbed your toe. It seems like the time at which the stubbing of the toe was harmful to you was at 7 a.m. It seems like stubbing your toe, at least in that case, did have a time in which it harmed you. Now, if you want to reject the timing argument by saying that death does not have a time at which it harms you, then you need to provide some explanation as to why. Why is the harm of death so unlike anything else in that regard? Especially because doctors seem to identify not just the cause of death when one of their patients dies, but also the time of death at which their patient dies. But of course, you would say, I don't deny that there's a time at which the person dies. I just deny that there's a time at which the death is harmful, and that's different. And so, in this respect, many of these possible responses to the timing argument make a distinction between the time of the event and the time of the harm. They say, for instance, that while your death may occur at 7 p.m. in, say, 2040, or whichever year it is that you actually die, they would say that the time at which it harms you is something different than that. Or perhaps that the time doesn't even exist at all if it turns out that mortal harm is timeless, which is to say that there is no time at which it does harm you. It just harms you timelessly. Note that this is not to say that it harms you at every time. That would be a combination of the before, during, and after view, according to which it would always be true that your death was harmful to you. Now, this is sometimes called the eternalist view about the mortal harm. One prima facie objection to this view is this. Suppose that you will actually die in 2040. Let's say January 1st of 2040 at 7 p.m. Okay. So that you will die in January 1st, 2040 at 7 p.m., according to this view, at least without any restrictions, was bad for you at the time of the Big Bang, and 1 billion years ago, and 1 billion years from now. And in fact, every time that exists, as a time, that is, has this peculiar fact that, suppose Matthew Jernberg dies at 2040, Matthew Jernberg's death at 2040 harms Matthew Jernberg. So, if you wish to defend this always view, this eternalist view, it seems like some sort of restriction has to be put into place in order to avoid this rather peculiar fact about the far past and the far future, mentioning facts about the harm of someone's death at all the times in which people actually die. So what we have here are 4 possible responses and combinations therein of different ways to deny that death is harmless by responding to the timing argument. So even if the conclusion of the timing argument is false, it at least forces us to identify when it is that death really does harm the one who dies. And the standard Epicurean dictum that when death comes, you are not, and when you are, death has not come, is what is doing the work to motivate that second premise that there is no time at which death harms the one who dies. And to further support that premise, there is a secondary argument, which I shall call the no subject argument, that Fischer helpfully summarizes in this chapter. So consider the following proposition. Someone, call him Sam. Sam dies at some particular time. Earlier I mentioned the year 2040, January 1st at 7 p.m. Now I named this person Sam as I usually just use a variable name, call him S. So S dies at time t. Okay, we can just consider that in the abstract. We can fill in the details, talk about Sam and 2040 if we wish, but it might be easier to state the argument using the variable names first and then fill in the details as necessary. Okay, so we are considering the proposition that S dies at time t. So suppose that a person is harmed at a particular time t. Now, of course, we shouldn't just assume that time t must be an instantaneous moment. It could very well be the case that this could be an interval of time. One interesting issue that Fischer doesn't really grapple with in this essay is the question of the duration of death itself, as distinct from the process of dying or the condition of being a corpse, that is to say, the condition of being dead. It is frequently assumed in the literature that death itself, as distinct from dying and being dead, must be an instantaneous moment. And this is what is partially motivating skepticism about the harm of death. For how could anything that's instantaneous harm you? Harms must have a duration, so the skeptic would say. However, this argument makes no such assumption. So, going back to the first premise of the argument. The first premise is, if a person is harmed at a particular time, t, then there is a property, call it H, such that S has that property H at time t. The second premise is, well, if that's true, if there exists a property H at time t that S has, then S exists at time t. However, it's not the case that S exists at time t because death annihilates the one who exists. That is to say, when the person dies, they cease to exist. Therefore, death does not harm the one who dies. That is to say, there is no harm to S at time t. Now, I identified a proposition, namely that S dies at t, because Fischer doesn't do this. However, I think that's a mistake. I think there has to be some reason for the fact that you're harmed. Harms don't just float free in abstract space. Much like if you know something, that is to say, if S knows that P, there is some proposition P that S knows. Likewise, if a person S is harmed at a particular time, there has to be some state of affairs in virtue of which the person is so harmed, like stubbing your toe. Okay, I apologize for some of the abstractness, but this version of the no subject argument is somewhat technical. Here's an easier way to understand it if all of that abstract language just kind of was too much. Just think of it like this. Okay, so we're operating on the secular worldview that death annihilates the one who dies. That is to say, when you die, you cease to exist. So the skeptic asks, how can you be harmed when you don't even exist? The thought motivating the question is that in order to be harmed, it's necessary that there must be someone who gets harmed. If death makes you cease to exist, then there is no person who can be harmed at that time, and so death is harmless. Hence, Epicurus's dictum, when death comes, I am not, and when I am, death is not. There's no time at which both death and me are co-present, and as such, it's harmless. And I also have no reason to fear that which is harmless, because fearing a harmless thing is irrational. We're supposed to feel better about the whole thing because, hey, there's no reason to fear it. However, the reason I was so careful about the formalization of the argument is because even though it makes mention to times, it's primarily about the non-existence of the subject. So what makes the no subject argument particularly problematic is not the timing of the mortal harm, but rather the fact that when the person dies, the death itself makes the person cease to exist, and it can't be harmful unless there's somebody who's harmed. The argument is formally valid, at least in my more abstract characterization. So what that means is that if all the premises are true, it's impossible for the conclusion not to be true. That is to say, there's no rational way to reject the conclusion of this argument if you accept all the premises. So, in order to defend common sense, according to Fischer, and reject the conclusion, which is to say, well, to defend the common sense view that death is harmful and does harm the one who dies, for anyone who dies, well then, you have to reject one of the premises. And what makes this argument so particularly difficult to respond to is it's very difficult to think about which premise you wish to reject, unlike the timing argument. The timing argument, I think, is much easier to respond to. So, just as a reminder, the first premise says that if somebody is harmed at a time, then there is a property, namely the property of being harmed, at that time. The second premise says that if there's a property that is the property of being harmed at a time, then the one who is harmed, the person S, exists at that time. However, premise 3 says the person does not exist at that time. Why? Because death annihilates the one who dies. So therefore, death is harmless, it concludes. So you might wonder about the motivation behind premise 1 and 2. The motivation behind premise 1 is it just seems to be using the language of properties. So if you say that somebody is harmed and there's a time at which they're harmed, that's another way of saying that they have a property of being harmed. So you may object to this first premise by saying that, well, harms are not properties. Harms are relations. And this would be somewhat similar to saying, for instance, Matthew is married. So the predicate term is married in the sentence that I just spoke in English, Matthew is married, is of a monadic form. That is to say, it's not described as a relation as another sentence I might say. For instance, Matthew is married to Aishagul. So the term married in that second sentence expresses a relation that obtains between two people. However, in the first sentence, Matthew is married, that's used as a simple predicate without relation to anyone else. This is one of the ways in which I think language disguises relations. So even though being married is true of me individually, that's only true in virtue of the relationship that I have with someone else, namely my wife. So even though the sentence, Matthew is married, seems to express what you might describe as a property of me, it really does not. It refers to a relation that obtains between two people, the marriage relation. So in that sense, it's a disguised relation, a relation in disguise. It's in disguise because the sentence does not make mention of anyone else, but it refers to a relation that does connect two people. And harms are very similar in this way. When you stub your toe, you don't just have a harm that obtains independently of anything else. No, you are harmed by some state of affairs or event that occurs. You are harmed by hitting your toe against the dresser. So that's another way of saying that Sam, say S, is harmed by the state of affairs that obtains in which Sam hits his foot into the dresser or stubs his toe. There may be multiple descriptions that apply to one and the same event. However, to respond to the no subject argument by saying that, well, harms are relations. They're not really properties. Even though if you say, well, Sam was harmed, Sam is harmed, well, those sentences are like saying Matthew is married. They express a disguised relation. The reason this objection doesn't really work against the no subject argument is because it doesn't really change anything. You can simply rephrase the argument and say, well, for premise 1, that if S is harmed by P at time t, then there is a relation between S and P at t. So the point is that what P expresses is simply redescribing harms as properties or even harms as relations. That's what makes it so difficult to disagree with as a premise. So we could reevaluate the third premise, but Fischer accepts the annihilationist view of death, that death really does annihilate its subject. That is to say, when somebody dies, they cease to exist. So Fischer doesn't want to deny that third premise, which means the only premise Fischer is left with to deny is premise 2, and that's why he describes it as the problem of predication. Premise 2 actually generalizes. So in order to be harmed, it's necessary that there must be somebody who is harmed is an interesting fact that applies not just to harming, but to any property or relation. Another way of putting it is the old metaphysical dictum that there can't be relations without relata. Now, relata are the things that are related by a relation. So, for instance, if you consider the is greater than relation, you might think about how 2 is greater than 1 as numbers. Well, if the numbers 1 and 2 didn't exist, it would be difficult, that is to say impossible, for it to be true that 2 is greater than 1. For the relation to obtain, it's necessary that there exist the relata. This, of course, is not to say that the things being related by the relation must exist necessarily. So think back about the marriage example. Neither me nor my wife must exist necessarily, but we both stand in the relation of is married to. That is to say, I am married to my wife and my wife is married to me. So that would be a good example of a relation which is contingent. That is to say, it need not necessarily obtain. it could have been otherwise. But since there can't be relations without a relata, one cannot be harmed unless there is someone who is harmed. It's a very intuitive premise. Who could deny it? Well, if we don't deny that premise, and we accept annihilationism about death, and we accept premise 1 because, well, it's just asserting the existence of a property or a relation that is what harm comes to, well, we have to accept the conclusion then that death is harmless. The no subject argument is very difficult to respond to. In order to respond to this argument, Fischer considers the various responses I gave earlier to the timing argument, and then independently argues for each of their different views, and then tackles whether or not they would solve the no-subject problem. The first view Fischer considers is what he describes as priorism. This is just the view that the time of the harm of death takes place before death has taken place. Or, to put it another way, death harms you before you die. Recall the timing argument. The timing argument requires you to identify when death harms the one who dies if you think that death is harmful. And if you can't do that, if you accept the premises, you have to accept the conclusion that death is harmless. So, the priorist says death harms the one who dies before you die. So, the relevant time is before. The priorist is open to allowing this time to vary between people, or perhaps it occurs throughout one's life. It's not really specified. Perhaps death harms newborn infants. As soon as they're born, or at the first moment of their existence, whatever that is, maybe it's in the fetus, maybe not. Whatever the first moment of the person's existence is, you could say, a certain priorist might say, that that is when death harms the one who dies. Or it could be some other time. It could be an interval of time. Who knows when? It just occurs before the event of death itself. And we'll just stay at that kind of general level because we already have reasons to reject this view. Even if you don't even specify it, it just occurs sometime before the event of death itself. That proposal is already problematic even before we specify exactly when that time is supposed to be. Is it a moment of time? Is it throughout your whole life? Does it begin at your first moment of existence and end right before you die for some reason? I'm not sure. We don't even have to specify. Let's just consider the general proposition that it's sometime before. I'm not going to tell you when. Before getting into my objections, which are several, let's start by considering its virtues. One advantage the priorist has is he solves the problem of predication. He can respond to the no subject argument. Why? Well, because death harms the one who dies while the person still exists. So there is a subject of harm. There's a harm and there's a person at the same time. Now, the time of the harm is different from the time of the death. That's defined by the view. It's prior. That's to say, the time of the harm occurs before your death, but the person exists. So it's not mysterious. We know who it is who is harmed because that person exists. Now, Fischer's objections to priorism are not very good. He simply says that the view is implausible on its face. And then he does the common thing in philosophy where you describe the view, and simply by describing the view, you take that as a reason to reject the view. So this isn't very different than just giving it the incredulous stare. You just stare at the person who asserts this view as if it's crazy. So what's so crazy about this view? Well, the thought here is that something harms you before it even occurs, and it can harm you even if you're unaware of it. It could very well be the case on this priorist view that your death that will happen in the future is harming you right now, or harmed you when you were born, or at some other time, or all the times in which you've been alive. It's not really specified. But the point is that it's harming you even though you're not aware of it. Just the condition of mortality, that you will actually die at some time in the future, is harming you at some point in your life. Yep, that's the view. Why is that a reason to reject the view? That is to say, give me an independent reason to think that this view is false. Fischer doesn't really do that, at least not in this first section. He later describes this as time travel. And so in that way, there is a reason to reject the view. And so that's a pretty powerful objection, namely that whatever makes death harm you, the timing of the harm occurs before the timing of the death, right? So if that's the case, that's a bit like time travel. So some future thing occurs, and because of the occurrence of a future thing, some change is made to the present, speaking from the perspective of someone who happens to be alive. So let's put a date on it. Recall that date. Suppose I die January 1st at 7 p.m. on 2040. And further suppose that that fact, that event in the future, harms me now, before I die. That's what the priorist is saying. Although it doesn't have to be that particular time, suppose it is. Suppose it's right now that I am being harmed by my future death in 2040. Okay, if that's true, then that's time travel. And you might think, for other reasons, that time travel is impossible. And so, the impossibility of time travel gives you a reason to reject priorism. That harms are not retroactive in that fashion. They don't travel into the past to change things, like whether I'm being harmed right now because of a future thing. Okay, so that's a pretty powerful objection, if you ask me. However, there is a possible response. Think about the normal relation between causes and effects, causal relations. And you might say, okay, I grant you that backwards causation is impossible, but the harm-making relation is not causal, you could say, to defend the priorist view. So the relationship between the event of death itself and the harm of death is not a causal relation. So your future death doesn't cause you to be harmed. It's a different kind of relation. It's a harm-making relation. That you are harmed right now in virtue of some future event that occurs in 2040 is not a causal relation. It is retroactive, but it occurs in virtue of some future fact. I think to motivate this response, you'd have to give other kinds of examples of changes that are occurring to you now in virtue of future things. So arguably, when I applied to graduate school and I was accepted, I was a prospective. My status changed from being a post-baccalaureate, I suppose, to becoming a prospective person to graduate school. Now, my admission to graduate school hadn't occurred yet. It obtained later in time, but my status changed to that of a prospective. And you might think that status obtained in virtue of a future thing, namely the admission that occurred later. And so, by analogy, much like the status of being a prospective, the status of being harmed by some future thing, namely mortality, one's own death in the future, is what changes the condition right now. So even though you are alive, you are a mortal being. Why are you mortal? Well, you're mortal in virtue of your future death that has not yet occurred. And you might think, well, if it turns out that some miracle happens and I never actually die in the future, well, then I'm immortal. So the status of mortality would be another example of some status that we would have in virtue of the future, and perhaps even the indefinite future or the infinite future if it turns out that someone alive today never dies. Of course, I don't think that's possible, but let's just imagine science fiction or fantasy scenarios where that would actually be the case. So the harm of death, the condition of mortality, and perhaps even the status of being a prospective graduate student would all be statuses that would obtain in virtue of future things, and that would help motivate this view of priorism, that harm-making is not a causal relationship, it's just retroactive, it obtains in this non-causal fashion in virtue of facts about the future and such. Now, I object to even that characterization, because think of the example of dying. So, suppose you're diagnosed with cancer, and but for some amazing medical intervention, you will die. That's merely a prediction made in the moment. Let's suppose that you do obtain an exceptional medical intervention, and the cancer is removed and goes into remission. I would say, retroactively, we could say, in hindsight, that you were not dying. However, if the actual sequence of events that obtained did result in your death, we could say retroactively that the process of your dying began at some state of metastasis of the tumors caused by the cancer. Now, I don't think that the dying process began when thought about in the moment prospectively, even if the tumor metastasizes at that time. At the time of the metastasis, the process of dying, you might think, has started, but it's not that it obtains at that time. It's rather that we can only say retroactively that it did obtain at that time. And that's not a mere diagnostic either. The fact that the dying began only becomes true when you die. At least that's what I would say. I think that's a more intuitive way of thinking about the past than allowing for time travel about the future. Although it is a troublesome case, so I'm not sure that there's any response to the question of when does dying begin that's not going to be unintuitive in some way. But this is a special case of the problem of processes which are chancy and yet are only complete upon their conclusion. Because I think it does make sense to say, if the medical intervention were to occur, that the person really wasn't dying to begin with. That they would be dying in the scenario in which the medical intervention does not occur and the person actually dies. Absent the actual death, the person was never really dying to begin with. And that's something I think we say retroactively because I think it tracks the way it actually works. Okay, so I considered an objection to the priorist view that it seems to require time travel in order to have future events harm you in the past. The response from the priorist was that, well, the harm-making relation is not causal, so it's not problematically time travel, it's unproblematically time travel. And then I gave some analogies to support that, and then I rejected those analogies in virtue of a different analogy about the dying process. So I would argue this retroactive way of thinking about the timing of the beginning of these processes would apply not just to the dying process, but to any of those other processes I mentioned earlier, or even status changes, such as the condition of being mortal, or the harm of death, or any of those other conditions. But there's a third objection to priorism that we haven't yet considered, but will come up in the next view as well. And this is the idea that it gives a special explanation as to what makes death harmful, or the nature of the harm of death. So the priorist is just attempting to explain what makes death harmful to the one who dies by giving a time at which it does harm the person who dies, namely before they die. But what about other harms? When you stub your toe, when does the toe stubbing harm you? And the priorist seems to give a totally different kind of explanation for the harm of death as what we get with stubbing our toes. So in that sense, mortal harm is of its own category. This is what philosophers sometimes describe in Latin as being sui generis. Typically, a sui generis explanation is not a very good one. It's what you may back into if you have no other alternative kind of explanation, but it rejects what I would describe as the continuity principle. So that's to say, whatever makes death harmful should be continuous with other types of harms in order to have a kind of unified axiology. That's to say, axiology is the study of value or goodness. Having a unified theory to explain what makes all harms harmful is a theoretically desirable thing to do. We should only reject this kind of theoretical unity if necessary. If we say there's this kind of discontinuous explanation for what makes death harm the one who dies, it's a harm unlike any other type of harm, that very well could be the case. Death is a very unusual kind of thing because unlike other kinds of changes, the subject does not persist through the change. Right? If I go from a seated position to a standing position, I've changed, but I didn't cease to exist. But if I die, I do cease to exist. So unlike so many other types of changes, you don't persist through the change. It annihilates you. That may have implications for its harm, supposing there is a harm, and I think there is. However, I don't think we should give a sui generis explanation, some kind of special explanation for the harm of death, if we haven't exhausted all of our options. That's why this is a theoretical cost. We would consider an explanation for mortal harm as sui generis only if there was no better explanation for why death would harm the one who dies. And if we have a better explanation or another explanation which doesn't make use of death's harm being this unique or special kind of thing, I think we should prefer that, theoretically. Or at least there's some reason to believe, for the sake of theoretical unity and a simplicity of explanation, that the theory that makes less special explanations for unique phenomena, that has a more unified value theory, is more likely to be true. So let's move on to another view about the timing of mortal harm, subsequentism. As you might tell from the name, this is the view that death harms the one who dies after they die. The harm is subsequent to the death and obtains after the death occurs. Ben Bradley defended this view in his book, Well-Being and Death, and part of the motivation behind the view is it makes the mortal harm continuous with other types of harms. So, for instance, when you got out of bed this morning and stubbed your toe, there was an initial surprise and then the throbbing began. And the idea is that the stubbing of the toe harmed you because of something that happened in the future of the initial hitting of the toe against the dresser. What made it harmful was the painful throbbing that occurred a few seconds later. And suppose it persists for several days. What makes the toe stubbing harmful is something that occurs after the initial event. And likewise, so too is death harmful. Death harms the one who dies, according to this view, after you die. Now, this might seem totally crazy, at first at least. Part of the reason it might seem crazy is because after you die, well, you don't exist. You can see how it does not solve the problem of predication. There is no subject of harm. After you die, you don't exist, so who's the one who's harmed? The thing that doesn't exist? No. To soften you up, Fischer and Bradley identify other types of characteristics people can have after they die. So while I might make a podcast about Bradley's book on another event, I'll just consider Fischer's examples that he gives in Chapter 4. So he gives the example of Aristotle having various properties now. For instance, he has the property of being written about by John Fischer. Or Abe Lincoln is now well regarded. FDR is regarded well for tackling the Great Depression. Abe Lincoln is regarded well for leading the fight against slavery and for being victorious after the Civil War. Stalin is considered quite nasty now and not just at the time. And Hitler is hated. And he's not just hated at the time, he's hated now. All of these are examples of historical figures who have long been dead. However, I think there's a kind of intentional fallacy that underlines these reputational examples. I mean, think what they all have in common. What they all have in common is a reference to people today. It's not that Aristotle has the property of being written about by John Fischer. It's rather that John Fischer has the property of writing about Aristotle. And it's not that Hitler has the property of being hated by people now. It's rather that people today, people now, have the property of hating Hitler, and likewise for the other examples, at least these examples. These are all cases of reputations or other forms of description or ways of thinking about people from the past. These descriptions can only erroneously be described as attributing things to past people occurring right now, because those people don't exist right now. They existed in the past, but not now. So rather, these descriptions are picking out properties we have. They're not picking out properties the historical figures have. Like I said, language can be misleading. However, there are some advantages to the subsequentist view, and I alluded to that earlier with my example of the toe stubbing. One advantage is it does endorse the continuity principle, namely that it supports a kind of unified explanation for what makes all harms harmful. The harm makers always occur after the initial event, regardless of whether we're talking about death or whether we're talking about toe stubbing. So that's one benefit of the view. Before we move on to my favorite explanation for when death harms the one who dies, I'm going to cover the other possibility, that is, atemporalism. Recall, this was the view that there is no time at which death harms the one who dies, but rather, instead of denying that death is harmful, the atemporalist says death is a timeless harm. It is both harmful and there is no time at which it is harmful. It is harmful timelessly. This is kind of an odd thing to say, and I already gave some objections to it earlier. But the first objection is it seems to give a special explanation for when death is harmful to the one who dies and treats all other types of harms normally. There's no great mystery about when the toe stubbing harmed you. It's not like the harm of stubbing your toe has no time at which it occurs, that the harm is timeless. However, there are atemporalists who do say something like this. Fischer quotes Tom Nagel. There's an amazing essay called Whole Life Welfarism by Ben Bramble. It's a different Ben than Bradley, although they're both hedonists. On Bramble's Whole Life Welfarism, death does harm the one who dies, but at no time at all. So it's an atemporalist view. However, it's an atemporalist view about all harms. That is to say, anything that's harmful, the event occurs at a time, but the harm is timeless. And for any bad thing that occurs to you, if it indeed is harmful, the difference it makes to the entire lifetime well-being you would have is the magnitude of the harm, if it's negative. If positive, it's a benefit. The advantage to Bramble's atemporalist view is it accepts a kind of unified account for when anything is a harm or anything is a benefit in accordance to what difference it makes to your whole life, to your lifetime well-being score. Think of it like a credit score, but instead of measuring your credit worthiness to take out loans and pay them back, it measures your lifetime well-being considered as a whole. So that's one way of defending an atemporalist explanation of the harm of death. Unfortunately, Fischer doesn't cite it, and instead just kind of concludes his section by suggesting that the subsequentist or the atemporalist are more preferable explanations for the timing of mortal harm rather than priorism. To my mind, I would not rank them in a similar fashion. I actually have a favored view, which, oddly enough, Fischer never considers, and that I would put that at the top rank. And then second tier, I would go with the atemporalist, then the priorist, and lastly, the subsequentist, because the subsequentist has no response to the no subject argument. It's just trying to soften you up by saying, well, there can be properties without that which instantiates the property. There can be harms without there existing any one who is the subject of that harm. And I think if we come up with a rigorous formulation of the no subject argument, which has its origins in Epicurus, what we will find is that the subsequentist has no good response to the no subject argument, and we will thereby be forced into accepting the Epicurean conclusion that death is harmless. Accepting the subsequentist view, Bradley's view, is a pathway to Epicureanism. So I've left what I consider the best for the end. But let me explain a little about why I think it's best. So let's go back to the toe stubbing example and think about the question, when did you hurt your toe? Did you hurt your toe a few seconds later after the initial hit when it started to throb? Or did you hurt your toe when you actually hit it against the dresser? When did the hitting of the toe harm you? Well, so far, we made this distinction at the beginning of the discussion between the time of a harmful event and the time of the harm. I think that was the first mistake. I don't think there is such a distinction, or at least it's a distinction without a difference. When does anything harm you? Well, when it occurs. It harms you when the event happens. This is called the concurrentist view, and it rejects the timing argument's second premise by saying that death does harm the one who dies at a particular time. So you may ask, well, if that's the case, when does death harm the one who dies? To which I answer, when you die. When else? That's the best answer. When does the stubbing of the toe harm the person who stubs his toe? When he stubs his toe. But you might object and say, what about the throbbing pain? And I say, yes, that's a harm too, but that's a different harm. I think we must individuate between the different harms on the basis of the time at which they occur. And in fact, I think it is necessary to so individuate the different harms in order to understand their causal connections and for the causal sequence to be intelligible. So you get out of bed and you hit your toe on the dresser. A few seconds later, the toe starts to throb. The hitting of the toe on the dresser harmed you, and it harmed you at the time at which you hit your toe. You then have a second harm in which it also begins to throb, which is caused by the first. And without individuating the two different harms, there's no way to make sense, at least for a full explanation of the causal sequence, how it is that one harm was partly what caused the second harm. So what about death? When does death harm the one who dies? When you die. But death as an event is the termination of the dying process. You might ask the Epicurean question, how can death harm you if death annihilates you? If death makes it the case that you cease to exist? Well, I don't deny that being a corpse does not harm you. There is no one who is a corpse who is harmed by the condition of being dead. Recall the trifold distinction between dying, death, and being dead. The condition of being a corpse occurs posterior to the event of death itself. That's not what we're considering. We're not considering whether the condition of being a corpse harms the one who dies. We're considering whether the event of death itself, considered as the termination of the dying process, harms the one who dies. And yes, it does. It's one of those liminal moments, you might say, if it is momentary at all, of which I am unsure. But it definitely is the end stage of the dying process and occurs before the condition of being dead. I think the subject is intelligible. You could say that the event of death itself is the last moment of your life at which you exist. And the first moment of the condition of being a corpse occurs after the event of death itself. And the event of death itself makes it the case that you cease to exist. The cessation of your existence occurs at the first moment of being a corpse. So, in that sense, death is something similar to the 0 point on your life. If you imagine your life as a kind of blip in two oceans of eternal non-existence, you might say, metaphorically or melodramatically, as a kind of blip between two intervals of time which extend into the infinite past, into the infinite future of eternal nothingness, and your life, as a matter of your existence, occurs in a brief and finite duration of time. Death, metaphorically, would then be the last moment of your existence and on the liminal edge of the first moment of your non-existence. And just as we can define a limit of a function, even if the terminal point is not included in the set, the limit approaching from the left-hand side of a continuous curve that is treated as an open interval over the domain approaches the 0 point without actually getting there. And yet, that limit is well defined, at least when considered from the left side, insofar as the limits of mathematical functions approaching a 0 point are well defined, so too is that of death. All right, in conclusion, I have so far described the timing argument for why death is harmless on the basis of there being no time at which it occurs. I have thereby also given a no-subject argument for why death is harmless because there is no one who is harmed, and compared different responses to the timing argument and what implications they have for the no-subject argument, and evaluated those responses partly on the basis of how well they succeed in not only responding to the timing argument, but more importantly, how they respond to the no-subject argument, which I regard as a much stronger argument. And if we're ranking different responses to the timing argument, in Tier 1 comes my favored response of that of concurrentism, with Tier 2 being the atemporalist response to the problem of the timing of mortal harm, Tier 3 being the priorist response, and I would even put Tier 4 as the Epicurean acceptance that death is harmless before I would ever accept the subsequentist explanation. The problem of predication is just too strong to accept that there could be a harm without the existence of the subject, at least for me. What are your favorite explanations as to when death harms you? What would your ranking be?